So please, if you have questions, you have the opportunity to read the biographies of these. We're going to have brief remarks, and then I'm going to take the questions and throw them to the panel, and we will get back on schedule, and everybody will learn something. And so with that, I'm going to forego my customary derogatory remark about the U.S. Navy and give the floor to Professor Jeff Macris.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Since you introduced me as being affiliated with the Naval Academy, I need to give a disclaimer that these words are my own only and not necessarily that of the U.S. Navy, the U.S. government, or the U.S. Naval Academy, although this year I'm affiliated with Yale University. Thank you very much. I've been asked to talk a little bit about the historical roots of the arms race that's ongoing in the Gulf today. And I'm a historian of the great powers in the Gulf by temperament and by training. And so I'd like to develop three main ideas. Number one, an outside power has played a leading role in maintaining order in the Gulf for the better part of the last 2 centuries. Number two, due to the anarchic nature of the Gulf, an outside power might in fact be required to maintain order in that region. And then number three, a declining U.S. dependence on oil, coupled with war weariness after the 2003 conflict there, is leading to an increasing U.S. disengagement from the Gulf, opening a power vacuum, a sense of insecurity on the local players in the Gulf, and resulting in the arms race that we're seeing today. So I'll take each one of these concepts in turn. First, an outside player has played a leading role in maintaining order in the Gulf for most of the past 2 centuries. From the early 1800s up until 1971, it was London who was a dominant player in the Gulf. The lines of communication and transportation from Europe to India made the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf critically important to London. Intertribal warfare in the 1800s frequently spilled out onto the seas, and that disrupted a chief economic activity in the region, pearling, and when that happened, it led to piracy. And piracy did directly threaten British interests in India. So Britain in the 1800s then began to deploy modest amounts of military force to the Gulf, usually naval, along with a handful of British Indian diplomats, and always the threat and the occasional use of a mammoth over-the-horizon army in British India. And over time then, Great Britain assumed several enduring security commitments. Maintenance of interstate order there, the free movement of trade in and out of the Gulf and by it, and the keeping out of other great power foes. So the British, as part of that, developed close alliances with ruling families in the Emirates of Kuwait and Bahrain, Qatar, what's now UAE, and Oman. And a string of small and virtually defenseless statelets emerged under British dominance because their presence suited Britain's interests. Which leads me to my second of 3 points, which is the anarchic nature of the Gulf political regime might require the presence of an outside power to maintain order there. And by anarchic, I don't mean there's anarchy in the Gulf states. In fact, as most of you know, the Gulf states are some of the most stable and safe places on earth. But rather, I use anarchic as a political scientist does, describing the Gulf region as lacking a supranational entity that can impose order on its component parts. And so that string of small emirates that emerged under British protection in the 19th and the 20th centuries almost certainly would have been subsumed by their larger neighbors if it weren't for London's presence in the region during that time. Kuwait probably would have been gobbled up by the Ottoman Empire and later Iraq. Bahrain by the Persians, Qatar and UAE by the expanding Wahhabi entity in the 1800s. And the anarchic nature of the Gulf is deepened further by the presence in the region of 3 regional powers: revolutionary Iran, Shia and Persian, at the edge of the great cultural divide between Arabs and Persians; Iraq, Arab with a Shia plurality; and Saudi Arabia, fiercely Wahhabi, Sunni Arab. So none of these is strong enough to get the others to submit, yet their differences are profound enough that there almost undoubtedly will be perpetual tension with one another. Put these together, the string of small statelets in the shadow of an antagonistic set of three regional powers, and you have the making of this anarchic system where the likelihood for interstate conflict is high and the rewards for interstate aggression are great. So for a century and a half, the British, for clearly self-serving reasons, helped to maintain interstate order in the Gulf region. But in the power vacuum that followed Britain's 1968 announcement of their impending withdrawal, the anarchic structure of the Gulf quickly showed. Iran, for example, grabbed a series of disputed islands. Later, revolutionary Iran funded separatist movements in Gulf states with Shia populations. And the border between Iraq and Iran flared, and nearly a decade-long war between Iraq and Iran commenced. And feeling the pain after each foreign policy setback in the Gulf in the 1970s and 1980s, the United States began to assume more security commitments. Washington deployed ships to the Indian Ocean. They built up Diego Garcia, formed a rapid deployment force, added airlift and sea lift, and escorted tankers through the straits during the Iran-Iraq War. But it was Iraq's seizure of Kuwait in 1990, however, that convinced American leaders that they could no longer tolerate the instability of the Gulf that had raged in the 2 decades following Britain's departure. Despite promises of returning home after Desert Storm, in 1991, Britain stayed in the Gulf, where they've been up until today, fulfilling essentially the same tasks that the British had done for a century and a half, maintaining interstate order, protecting the free flow of trade, oil, and denying the region to great power foes. Which leads me to my third and final introductory point. A declining dependence on imported oil and a war weariness after the 2003 conflict is contributing to U.S. disengagement from the Gulf, opening a power vacuum and giving rise to increased regional tensions and the arms race that we're seeing now. Coupled with a backlash from the unpopular 2003 invasion of Iraq, a decreased dependence on Persian Gulf oil has soured American leaders' willingness to remain engaged in the Gulf. And this is true over 2 consecutive presidential administrations, one Democratic and one Republican, leading us to believe that this is a trend. There are a couple of things that serve as an example of U.S. disengagement for the region. President Obama in 2011, disengaging from Iraq. The U.S. tepid response to Iran's attacks on Persian Gulf shipping, oil shipping in the past couple of months. And then finally, just within the past few days, President Trump's administration abandoning the Kurds. So the message to Gulf Arab capitals is clear. The U.S. cannot and probably should not be trusted to follow through on its security commitments. So, in 2019, in summary, the Gulf looks a lot like the region did almost exactly 50 years ago in 1969, when the British were in the process of walking away from their historic roles of maintaining order, protecting trade, and keeping out other great powers. Then, as now, the local powers armed themselves, getting ready for the violence that they thought was to come, just as we're seeing today. So, in summary, my 3 main points are, number 1, an outside power has maintained order in the Gulf for most of the past 2 centuries. Number 2, due to the anarchic structure of the Gulf, an outside power just might be required to maintain order in the region. And then finally, number 3, a declining U.S. dependence on imported oil is contributing to U.S. disengagement from the Gulf, opening a vacuum and giving rise to increased regional tensions and the arms race that we're seeing today. Thanks.
All right. Once again, write your questions on the cards, pass them out, we'll get it. Our next speaker is somebody who I find that she speaks at events and then articles start bubbling up that basically reflect what she said at the event. It takes about a week or 2. From the Washington Institute, former colleague of the current Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, David Schenker. It's a great pleasure to introduce Elena Delosier.
Thank you so much. I love that. What I'm talking about today, I've actually already written, so I guess I'm going against protocol. I'm here to talk about nuclear issues, and so the two nuclear issues in the Gulf area are Iran and Saudi Arabia. So I'll leave the Saudi question for the question and answer session, but the very quick summary about their program is that they are building a facility for a reactor at the moment. There were indications it could be done by the end of this year, but they won't be introducing any sort of nuclear material until they sign the relevant agreements through the IAEA in order to have nuclear material present on site. And so that's sort of the thing we're looking at with regard to Saudi's program in 2020. I'm happy to answer any questions about MBS's comments about we'll get a bomb if Iran gets a bomb and all of that. On the Iran question, the one thing that I would like to say is just that in the time period that we're between the JCPOA and whatever comes next, if something comes next, what Iran is looking to do is really move the goalposts, and they're very good at this. So the quick example is, they were enriching to 3.5% in 2003 when the Europeans were talking to them. By the time we were having the JCPOA, or what became the JCPOA discussions in 2015, they were enriching to 19%. So you went from negotiating whether they're allowed to enrich at all to negotiating, whether they're allowed to enrich to 3% or 19, right? So there's a moving of the goalpost that happens. And some of the things, they've been moving the goalposts recently a bit by increasing production levels, starting to use advanced centrifuges that they weren't even using prior to JCPOA, redesigning Natanz, one of their nuclear facilities, for those advanced centrifuges, which means raising the ceilings and things like that, and not really making progress on the Iraq facility, which has now been renamed, and the Fordo facility, which were meant to convert those facilities to something that would be less of a proliferation concern. There's still a lot of things they can do. I'm happy to talk in the question and answer more about the things that they could still give up. They've come out in the last week suggesting that there's now this fourth wave of things that they're going to give up, so we can talk about what those things are. But I think that those are the two issues kind of going into the next few months that we're paying attention to. Iran moving the goalposts, and then sort of what is happening with Saudi's program.
Thank you for brilliance and brevity. We've been treated to sort of the crown jewels of American diplomats in this room today. And one of the persons who've had one of the more difficult portfolios in the U.S. government is Ambassador to Yemen, and now is currently the Vice President of the Middle East Institute, Ambassador Gerald Firestein.
So we're now down to the zircons of American diplomacy.
Hey-o!
I was asked to speak on the subject of contradictory objectives between the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia in Yemen. I was going to begin in the Jahiliyyah, but in the interest of time, I'll fast forward to now. And basically to make the point that from the beginning of the Arab Spring until sometime in 2016, 2017, actually the Saudis and the Emiratis were pretty well aligned. They cooperated all through the negotiations in 2011, 2012. They agreed on the requirement to intervene militarily in Yemen in the beginning of 2015 as a reflection of what they both perceived was going on. So the divisions between the Saudis and the Emiratis really didn't begin to appear until the conflict in Yemen became stalemated in 2016, 2017, and they began to perceive their interests and their steps forward in different ways. And so, as the military stalemate persisted, as the political process, the negotiations under the UN auspices failed, the Emiratis became increasingly frustrated with the situation, and they began to talk in 2017 about their desire to withdraw from Yemen and to get out of the military campaign. Ilana and I were both actually in Abu Dhabi earlier this year and heard from Emirati officials their explanation for why it was that they believed that they had come to a point where they could no longer, or where they could withdraw from continued engagement on the military campaign. And they basically gave two explanations. One was mission accomplished, which was that the Emiratis believed that they had successfully stood up Yemeni indigenous military forces that were capable of taking on the challenge of confronting the Houthis, and that the Emiratis themselves no longer needed to be involved in the front lines of that effort. And then the second explanation was Homeland Security. And in a moment, as Jeff Macris was talking about, in a moment where the tensions in the Gulf were escalating, and it looked increasingly possible that there was going to be a military confrontation between the U.S. And its partners in the region and Iran, that the Emiratis believed that they needed to bring their defense forces home, particularly the Patriot batteries that had deployed to Yemen, that they consider to be essential for homeland defense. So those were the two kind of explanations we heard. Subsequent to that, we heard a third explanation, which was the idea that the Emirates were signaling to the Iranians their openness and desire for a political resolution of the conflict in Yemen. Whether or not that actually factored into their thinking at the time is unclear, but my view is that if they want to claim that as an explanation, we should encourage them to do that. In my view, there are three kind of possible explanations for why the Saudis and the Emiratis are diverging in terms of their Yemen engagement. The first is that the Saudis and the Emiratis have very different perspectives on what Yemen means to their national security. And if you look at the history of Saudi Arabia going all the way back to the 1930s, they have always seen Yemen as a potential soft underbelly for their own security. The security of their southern border, the idea that instability in Yemen could spill over and affect the internal domestic security in Saudi Arabia has always been a factor in Saudi thinking, and it has in many ways shaped the way Saudi Arabia has engaged with Yemen over these past 75 years. Obviously, the situation for the Emiratis is very different. Emirates does not have a common border with Yemen, has not seen Yemen in the same way as a threat to their own stability. Beyond the specific issue of Saudi Arabia's perspective on cross-border security, the other factor, the other implication for their different perspectives on Yemeni stability is that the Emirates are not as focused on maintaining Yemeni unity as the Saudis are. And again, the Saudis see the potential of a fragmented, broken up Yemen as something that could have cross-border implications for their own stability and security. A second factor is political Islam. And here the situation is reversed. So for the Emirates, and particularly for Mohammed bin Zayed, they see the MB in Egypt as a direct threat to their own security and stability. And therefore, they have taken an extremely firm position on whatever they see as Muslim Brotherhood in the region. And that, of course, includes political Islam in Yemen, and the implications of what that means in terms of their perspective on the Hadi government, which incorporates the Islah Party, which is, of course, or has been an affiliate of the MB. The Saudis, different perspective. They both share concerns about the potential implications of the Muslim Brotherhood for their own security, but for the Saudis, clearly, it doesn't have the same immediacy that it has for the Emiratis. And so, in terms of the internal situation inside of Yemen, the Saudis have been much more willing to work with the Hadi government and even to maintain close contacts with key senior officials of the Islah Party, including Ali Mohsen, as well as Mohammed Yadoumi and Abdul Wahab Alansi, all of whom are in Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis never felt the same way about what does political Islam in Yemen mean for their own security interests. And then the third factor in what's driving the Saudis and the Emiratis farther apart is the very different perspectives that the two bring to how they see Yemen playing into their ultimate regional objectives. And in this case, again, Saudi Arabia sees Yemen primarily in the context of its own domestic security, sees the unity of Yemen as being an important factor in preserving their own security interests, and wants to ensure, one, that they have a secure southern border, two, that there's a friendly government in Sana'a, and three, that the Iranians don't, through either IRGC or Hezbollah, establish a foothold inside of Yemen. For the Emirates, though, their ambitions vis-a-vis Yemen go far beyond just the security and territorial integrity of Yemen. They see Yemen as a stepping stone to achieving a broader regional objective, which is to establish UAE as a key political, economic, and security player in the entire Red Sea littoral. And so looking at Yemen in the context of what they're trying to establish in Bosaso, in Berbera, in Asab, and really to build up a string of friendly partners in the region that will allow them to cement their position in the broader region. So these divergent goals and objectives have led to tensions between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi as they clash over developments in the south and east of Yemen, as well as on the island of Socotra. The failure of the two major coalition partners to communicate and coordinate their actions has weakened the fight against the Houthis and undoubtedly led to an extension of the conflict at the expense of the majority of Yemeni citizens. And let me stop there.
Never has a cubic zirconia shone so brightly. Professor Macris reminded me, I also have to give the disclaimer that I do not speak for any agency or branch of the United States government, which generally is apparent the moment I open my mouth, but I have to say it nonetheless. So let me give you a little bit of military trivia here. A lot of people will say Afghanistan is America's longest war. And I think that that is a good way to find somebody who is unfamiliar with American military history. We fought the Seminoles from more or less continuously from 1817 until 1859. But it is worth pointing out that the United States has continually been involved in military actions in Iraq through 5 successive presidential administrations. Our presidents has been continuous, either on the ground in Iraq or in the airspace over it since the administration of George H.W. Bush. And we have one of the premier historians of Iraq here today, Professor Abbas Kadim, who will talk about that. I want to urge you to, again, get your questions written down and up here. So, Dr. Abbas.
Well, thank you very much, and great to be with this distinguished panel. It is wonderful to be in D.C. back. I have been in Iraq for 3 weeks and a half and got out after the protests stopped, so it was really a privilege to be in Iraq always, but also exciting times every time I go So first, I will start with a few observations that are fresh from my stay in Iraq. I just came back less than a week ago, and then talk about the topic that I was asked to comment on, which is the general security and defense of Iraq, and these are intertwined in a way. Going to Iraq, I go there 4 or 5 times a year, and I observe how the situation moves, what the trajectory of the security and other issues in Iraq. And if I were to take or discount the 4 days before my return, initially, the trend was the same. Security was improving highly. People were more relaxed. The green zone is no longer a green zone unless you are too close to the U.S. Embassy. That's still, the checkpoint there is impossible to get through. But everything else really is now you drive anytime during the day or night freely. The general sense of the people that this is a place that is becoming more and more normal every time you go and you see the country. So that's a very good news. And even with the protests, of course, the media kind of really put an interesting spin on the magnitude of them, etc., and that is understood. But looking at it from inside Iraq, from driving on the streets, it was not much of a security threat, but it was more of a political threat to the government. In other words, you drive in Najaf or in Baghdad or in Hilla. I was in most of these provinces that are in Baghdad and south of Baghdad. You don't feel threatened. Your security is not a concern. Most of the province is not really part of what you see riots or protests, but only limited locations where people are gathering just before the nightfall, and then you hear occasional sporadic shots being fired in the night, but that's about it. And that, of course, is not to minimize the protests. As I said, on the political level, they are extremely important, but as a security issue, they are not. And that is, of course, will be valid until the 25th of October when there is a planned massive protest. If the government becomes smart between now and the 23rd, not to the 25th, because the last 2 days, it doesn't matter what you do, then they can probably reduce the number of people who will go to the streets to make more protests. Certainly the protests were very spontaneous, but like every time in Iraq they happen, they were politicized, and many parties out of the government entered in them. There were so many other people in social media, etc. So it became worse. But they were not much of protests against Adil Abdel Mahdi. They were protests against the entire system since 2003 that has not figured out how to provide Iraqis with good governance, with basic services, and also to do anything other than accumulating more problems and more shortcomings and deficiencies as we go. It is an accumulation, and always there is a spark that brings people to the protests in the streets, and once protests take place, you will start seeing all of the grievances being recalled from previous years, and that is the nature of the situation. But in general, the trajectory of the security is going well. The trajectory of the Iraqi security forces capabilities are becoming better, and I will speak about that in a second. But as I said, the political situation in Iraq is up in the air, unfortunately, because Iraqis until now haven't figured out how to put their act together and provide good governance for the Iraqis. That is the issue of the protests and where things are going in Iraq. It is an issue, as I said, of basic services, of good governance and an economy. The Iraqis are no longer having security as their number one concern. I was in Baghdad attending 2 fora, and both of them were about the economics of Iraq. One of them is on the economics of energy, and the other was on the economics of in general. And in past years, you go there, and everybody is talking about security, security, and security. So it tells you where that the defeat of ISIS, I think, proved Iraqi resilience and proved that Iraqis are past the security concerns and they are more towards the more immediate issues. And this is an important question. The government needs to think hard about the future, about how to activate many sectors in the economy. Iraqis, 50% of Iraqis right now are under 19 years old. 40% of them are under 14. This demographic is scary for any state to deal with, and we are adding 1 million to that category every year. Means also there is 1 million that is going to the job market as well, and there are no jobs. So it is a ticking time bomb. Either Iraqis can use it as an opportunity by educating these people and getting them ready for the jobs of the next 15 years, or maintain them as a burden and a ticking time bomb, people who are sitting idle and they are ready to be recruited by anybody to do anything bad in or outside Iraq. And that is an issue really hard for the Iraqis to understand. Just one final note on this about an earlier panel that said these were Shia demonstrators against a Shia government and the Sunnis did not demonstrate. If I were a Sunni, I'm a Shia, I would be offended. Half of Baghdad are Sunnis. Did people just have a certain kind of camera that said everybody is demonstrating as a Shia? All right. That is really absurd to say that by the media and everybody, including inside Iraq. This is a Shia demonstration. No, it was a demonstration of people. Probably this is one of the least, if ever, a demonstration or a protest that has to do with sect and sectarianism. Iraqis, most of them are youth who have nothing to do with sectarian issues, are demonstrating in the streets. There are also others in other provinces. Also, if you talk about the Shia only, 3 or 4 provinces among the Shia majority provinces demonstrated. There are others, several provinces in Iraq that are Shia majority did not demonstrate. The Kurds did not demonstrate, who are Sunni and Kurd as well. So I think it is not an accurate depiction of what went on to say these are Shia demonstrating a Shia government. These are really Iraqi youth who feel like that they are not given the hope they deserve and they are entitled to, or the effort to provide them with the hope they are entitled to, and they are demonstrating for that. So, and also, the Sunnis have made their point. They did demonstrate once, twice, 3 times. Any demonstration in Sunni areas, it would be redundant because they already made their voice heard. Also, and to put another point, where are the Sunnis now? They are IDPs, their places are depleted, they are in really a situation that you don't want to see after ISIS. Most of these areas are still stand in ruins. They don't have the appetite to go to the streets again while they have more issues at hand right now. These are not just sitting around and feeling like their Shia brothers are demonstrating and they don't want to take a part in that. So let me take 1 minute more about the general security of Iraq. And I will not, even though I was presented as whatever it is, adjectives, historian, I am a historian of Iraq, and I really appreciate your kindness to me. But I can't go over history in 10 minutes. Iraq has 7,000 years, and before the Jahiliyyah, Mr. Ambassador. So just to say that problem of Iraq security is that Iraq, by the time of the U.S. departure in 2011, end of 2011, was not given a military that was capable to stand its ground. That is a fact. No matter what U.S. generals say, that they did a great job and Maliki corrupted the military. This is just a bunch of whatever. Okay, I was serving as an assistant professor at the Naval Postgraduate School at the time, very close to the ways. Until 2010, Iraqis did not have a manual of logistics. I was the one who oversaw the translation of the Air Force logistics, to give to the Iraqi military. And you know what they say about logistics? They cannot win a war, but they can single-handedly lose a war. Okay? There was no interoperability. There was no Air Force. There was nothing in Iraq. So Ash Carter was right when he stood by Congress and said the Iraqis. And until this word, he was right. And then he should say, cannot fight. He said they don't have the will to fight. They could not. They did not have the capability to fight at the time. However, the ISIS war proved two things: Iraqi resilience and Iraqi will to fight. And they did, with invaluable help from the United States, a coalition, and several other neighbors. They did defeat ISIS. They did all of the heavy lifting and gave all the casualties. And they ended up with a better military than they started with in 2014 when it melted away and it basically was defeated by a ragtag militia. So 2014, 2015 counts a lot, that it gave Iraqis confidence and experience. And also whatever we have to say about the PMFs, the Popular Mobilization Force, some of them are still a great asset for Iraq if you take away a few that are not really more into helping the Iraqi state, but they have loyalties outside Iraq. Most of the PMF is an important asset given the current situation in Iraq. And another thing, and I will conclude with that, is that helping Iraqi security is that Iraqis lost a lot of their previous appetite for civil conflict. ISIS and what was previous experiences did show the Iraqis that they were the only losers from that, and they needed to move on, and I think they move on. All what they need right now is a good economic vision and a good governance vision to move them away from the need to have conflict to the need to have a better life for themselves and their next generations. Thank you.
Okay, once again, your questions, and thank you, Dr. Abbas, for a somewhat contrarian view. And also, we're used to thinking of Iraq as sectarian conflict by raising the potential of intergenerational conflict in rising youth. Speaking to me specifically as the father of a 17-year-old, you just scared the living hell out of me. So good way to get your audience's attention. There are three people in this world who everything they write I find instantly worthy of reading, no matter what time, day or night. And one of them is here on our panel today. From the RAND Corporation, Becca Wasser writes on security issues in the Gulf and is generally one of the more footnoted people I know. I find that her remarks are always worth seeing. So write down your questions, and then we will have the free form. But first, let's enjoy and get illuminated by Becca Wasser.
So I was asked to speak today about the U.S. security guarantee in the region. And when I was asked to speak on this topic back in May, it was a much easier one to handle. Recent events have kind of put a pin in that. So I'm actually going to start off by disagreeing politely with our first panelist, who asserted that the U.S. Looks as though it is on the precipice of withdrawing from the Middle East more broadly, including the Gulf, and that the Gulf states can't rely on the U.S. security guarantee. With all due respect, I don't believe that to be the case. I think instead what we see is a cyclic pattern of engagement where the U.S. tries to reprioritize, and sometimes this does lead to diminishing some of its existing resources that happen to be in the Middle East. But when push comes to shove, these don't come out of the Gulf. These come out of places like Iraq and elsewhere. So the Gulf in particular remains the backbone of the U.S. security architecture in the region. But what it does do is it in turn leads to a loss of faith in the U.S. security commitment by the Gulf states, and in many cases, quite rightfully. But over time, they find that there isn't really another viable option. They can't really do it on their own at this point in time, given some of the choices that have been made about their militaries, particularly their military effectiveness, and also other countries that they seek to engage either as a hedge or to potentially step in as an alternative security guarantor are either unwilling or unable to take that role. So that's sort of my respectful disagreement with our first panelist on that note. So, and I think that that's true even today. And today, you know, there has been this recent decision by the Trump administration to withdraw U.S. military forces from Syria at the expense of America's Kurdish partners. And this has led to putting U.S. reliability and its commitment in question. And again, rightfully so. These are open questions that ought to be asked. But even with some of the transactionalism that has been demonstrated by the Trump administration and President Trump's overall sort of impulse to withdraw U.S. forces from the region, the U.S. remains and is going to continue to remain the primary security guarantor in the Gulf region. And I can point to sort of 3 data points to back up this argument. The first is you have to look at the extensive basing infrastructure that is in the Gulf. These are permanent bases. They're not hastily constructed forward operating bases that U.S. forces might end up blowing up like we saw in Syria. This is permanent architecture, permanent infrastructure, and a lot of times these are co-located with regional forces as well. The U.S. has recently returned a sizable military presence to Saudi Arabia after having left Saudi Arabia in 2003. Again, the U.S. would not be putting resources towards improving that basing infrastructure, making sure that runways can go, if they were just looking to leave. That's a waste of resource, it's a waste of time. The second data point is to look at the recent deployments to the Gulf in response to Iranian provocations in the region. For the most part, these attacks were against U.S. partners rather than U.S. equities, aside from the downing of the U.S. Unmanned aircraft. And because of that, the U.S. has put pretty sizable troop presence as well as equipment and kit. I mean, a carrier strike group is nothing to sneeze at. And then returning an uptick of about, I think the number that was cited is 14,000 U.S. troops to the Gulf. I mean, on top of what they already have in these permanent bases, it's not inconsequential. So again, you contrast that with Syria, where there was a recent withdrawal of about 1,000 U.S. troops, and at the same time, there's been an increase of 14,000. That should be reassuring to a certain degree. And then lastly, both Russia and China are most often the 2 countries that are turned to by the Gulf states to act as a hedge, to signal to the United States that they have other options. But both countries are really uninterested at this point in time in playing this security guarantor role to the extent that the United States has and can. And also in the case of Russia in particular, it does not have the resources to actually play that role in a sustainable way for more than one country. Right now, Russia is a bit overtaxed just with Syria alone. So with all of these data points, I would just again say the U.S. is the primary security guarantor in the Gulf, and it is likely to remain the U.S. security guarantor in the Gulf, regardless of some of the more recent events.
Thank you. All right. Questions. So I'm going to start.